Thanks, Steve. Meantime, Major League Baseball moving this year's All-Star Game and Draft out of Atlanta. It's the latest and so far a most impactful move by an organization in response to Georgia's controversial new voting law, which many claim disenfranchises black voters. Joining us right now to talk about Georgia's voting law, business, politics, and the intersection of all three is Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. We should mention on Wednesday last week, Senator Cotton tweeted out, now that all these ill-informed CEOs are smearing Georgia with left-wing lies about its new election law, I welcome any of them to debate me. I'll do it on Squawk Box so they can have a home field advantage. How about it, Ed Bastian, Larry Fink? And he tagged Delta and BlackRock. Neither of them are here, Senator, so you are stuck with me. But thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, I see that none of these ill-informed, politically correct CEOs were willing to come on your prestigious show to debate me this morning, to get into the details of this law, since most of them only have been speaking in vague generalities, pressured by the far left to condemn Georgia
Senator,
unfairly and without reasonable basis.
Senator, let's talk about that, though, because clearly there are now dozens of companies that have spoken out against this law. And I think the big question, and you heard it from Anthony Scaramucci before in the last hour, is whether the Republican Party is effectively pushing business, which was clearly an ally for so very long, into the hands of Democrats.
Well, it's not a question for me. I mean, the people we represent are the workers and the families in our communities across the country. Sometimes businesses are right, sometimes they're wrong. But CEOs that run airlines or pharmaceutical companies or credit card companies or sports leagues aren't really experts when it comes to voting laws. And that's been made perfectly clear over the last week. Their attacks on Georgia's voting law are ill-informed. They don't have a basis in fact. Delta even praised the law before they flip-flopped and then started attacking it under pressure from the left.
Senator, let's talk about some of the details just to educate the audience, because I accept that there are elements of the law which on the face look helpful to expanding access. But at the same time, when you get into the details, in fact, there are lots of issues. And I think that business is looking and seeing those issues, and that's why they're speaking out. Let me give you an example. For example, 94 Dropboxes across the 4 counties that make up the core of metropolitan Atlanta, which I should say is where the majority of black voters in the state live, and in fact is considered a Democrat weighted area. They had 94 Dropboxes. It goes down to 23. I think that's just a very clear example, as one example, of the problems that this law creates. No?
No, not at all, Andrew. Dropboxes were a recent and emergency addition last year at the height of a pandemic. Many states added them by executive fiat or court order, but they are not some long-standing practice of American election law. This bill, though, actually expands the use of Dropboxes by mandating that counties use them no fewer than 1 per 100,000 persons. Now, voters can also go into the clerk's office or their local registrar's office and drop off their ballot. Of course, they can put their ballot in the mailbox outside their home at any time up until the designated period ends. I would also point out that Joe Biden's home state, Delaware, only has 5 Dropboxes for the entire state. Is Joe Biden going to condemn Delaware as passing a Jim Crow 2 law? What about New York State? New York State does not use Dropboxes at all. Is Rob Manfred going to move Major League Baseball's headquarters out of downtown Manhattan? Somehow I doubt it, Andrew.
But Senator, I think the larger issues, and we can debate, which state does it better. But clearly, in the state of Georgia, and frankly across the country, we now have states that are introducing bills that, almost by default, if you look at them really closely, do limit voting, and especially for people of color. And I raised the issue. We had Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier on this program. 72 very senior black executives coming out historically for the very first time, effectively calling out a law and calling out their peers. Why would they feel this way otherwise?
Yeah, I read their letter and I saw their interview. Again, it was ill-informed. It didn't cite specific provisions of the law that were somehow designed to suppress voting. I mean, one commonly cited feature is that you now have to use information from your driver's license or personal identification card on your absentee balloting. That's an improvement over signature verification, which can be arbitrary and difficult for election volunteers to do. I also note that you have to show an ID every time you get on an airplane at Delta. You have to show an ID to get a ticket at Major League Baseball's will call offices. Again, this is just an example of them buying into left-wing smears against Georgia without a basis in fact.
But in terms of the smear, let me ask you this, because I think it's probably the biggest issue, and Ed Bastian called it a lie, which is to say, what is the evidence that there was a problem that triggered what is now 330 ballot restriction initiatives in 43 states? I mean, that's the ultimate question, and I don't believe there was a court case that ruled in favor or even suggestive that there was ultimately a problem.
Well, Andrew, what Governor Kemp in Georgia has explained is their elections had a lot of problems last year in terms of inefficiencies and delays and so forth. And it wasn't just on November 3rd. Look at their primaries in the summer as well. They had lines in which voters were waiting for hours. Governor Kemp has said that's not acceptable to him, and it shouldn't be to normal voters. What this law is designed to do is to make sure that their elections are streamlined and efficient, that voters have convenient, accessible voting options, and that those options are safe and secure.
Right.
I mean, for Ed Bastian and James Quincy at Coca-Cola to get up on their moral high horse when, for instance, Coca-Cola is lobbying behind the scenes in Congress against a slave labor bill for China's religious minorities, or Delta partners with a Chinese Communist Party-owned airline, really is the height of moral hypocrisy.
Senator Cotton, you talked about there being long lines in Georgia, and yet one of the most criticized parts of the Georgia bill is one that makes it a misdemeanor in order to, if you serve water to people standing in line. What do you find the justification for that is?
Literally every state in the union, Steve, has laws that prevent people from approaching voters in line. The idea is to prevent campaigns and parties from trying to campaign right next to a polling place to even coerce and intimidate. New York State, for instance, prohibits the provision of food or drink to voters who are in line. Now, the law does say explicitly that campaign workers, that poll officials, can provide water to people who are in line. But this is a very common practice all across the country. Moreover, the entire point of the law, as I explained, was to streamline these elections in Georgia, make them more efficient, so you don't have the kind of long lines that you saw last year, not just on November 3rd, but in the summer. That's exactly what it's going to do. Seizing on the practice that is common across states all around the country about approaching voters who are in line is just another example of how the left is smearing Georgia, and these ill-informed CEOs are just buying it hook, line, and sinker because they don't want to be protested, they don't want to be boycotted, they don't want their little social justice warriors with their newly minted Ivy League MBAs rising up in their corporate headquarters.
Yeah, I think you just touched on this a little bit, Senator Cotton, but whether it's the voting laws discussion that we're having now, looking at Georgia and some of the other states, whether it's the protests we saw last summer, in general, we have seen basically this paradigm shift in the way that corporate America is now going from neutral to being very outspoken about social and socioeconomic issues, for better or for worse. Why do you think CEOs of these companies that are taking a stand believe this is good business?
I think they're afraid of left-wing attacks, and they're afraid of being attacked on cable news and in the newspapers that they read. They're worried about, again, the very activist, young social justice warriors they have working in their corporate headquarters. But I can tell you, these CEOs do not speak for their entire workforce. I've literally encountered hundreds of gate agents and baggage handlers and pilots and flight attendants for Delta, for instance, during my time in public life, who have thanked me for the work I'm doing in the Congress and said they support Donald Trump. So I'd encourage all of those conservative and Republican employees who work in Delta's workforce or Coca-Cola's workforce to be more active themselves. You should send emails to your CEO, the way the media reports suggest all of these left-wing employees were doing so, and encourage them to stick to running an airline or selling sugary beverages to Americans.
You have been a recipient of money over the years from many of the same companies that are now speaking out publicly against these laws. How do you square that? I'm thinking of Bank of America. I'm thinking of Walmart. I'm thinking of Paul Weiss, a law firm which has now made a big effort to actually fight these laws across the country.
Oh, it's very simple, Andrew. I don't endorse my donors' agenda. They endorse my agenda, and they know that when they contribute to me, whether it's $5 or $5,000, that I'm going to do what's right for Arkansas and what's right for America. And what's right for America is to have safe, convenient, accessible elections. That's exactly what this Georgia law has done. What's not right is to have these moral corporate hypocrites weighing in on public policies when they don't have any specific knowledge about them, they don't have any particular expertise, and they haven't taken the time to inform themselves about the facts.
Senator, while we have you here, wanted to get you get your thoughts on a couple other big headlines this morning, including one that Steve Leisman just broke within the last hour around Janet Yellen proposing a global, if you will, AMT for corporations. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, we'll see what she says later today, but I would just note to some of these corporate CEOs who run to Capitol Hill and lobby Republicans privately to protect them from Joe Biden's tax policies and his regulatory policies that if you want Joe Biden's election laws, you might wind up with Joe Biden's tax laws as well.
Senator Cotton, I'm sorry, just a second here. After what you said, I went up and looked up the Georgia law. It says nothing about providing only political organizations providing. It says no person shall provide food and water to a person standing in line. So I just want to make sure that my understanding is correct here, that it's not banning political groups, it's no person at all.
Yes, Steve, no person can approach a voter in line within a certain proximity of the polling place. That's very common in states around the country. But poll workers or officials at the polling site can provide water, whether it's a water fountain or, say, a Gatorade jug or so forth. So no one's going to be standing in line without access to water. And the whole point of the law is to make sure that no one is standing in line long enough to need water in the first place.
Senator, I want to go back to the, we were just talking about corporate tax rate and the fact that that's proposed to increase now with this infrastructure spending bill. In terms of the infrastructure bill itself, what would it take for you to get on board? Are you on board?
No, I'm not on board. This bill is a Trojan horse for major tax hikes on America's workers and families. It spends more money on things like electric vehicles than it does on roads and bridges and ports and airports.
Would you do a skinnier bill?
There is a way to there is a way to pass an infrastructure bill. I would remind everyone that the reason why we're working on an infrastructure bill this year is the last one was passed in 2015. It expires this year. It was passed in 2015 with more than 80 votes, in no small part because it didn't have tax increases, and it focused on some of the real problems with our infrastructure system, which is too much red tape and the permitting and regulatory approvals we need. So as some of my Republican colleagues have said, we'd be happy to sit down and work with the Democrats on trying to find a bipartisan compromise. But if they just want to smuggle in their long-standing liberal wishes and add a bunch of tax increases on top of it, I don't think you're going to get much Republican support.
Senator, in terms of corporate taxes, is there a rate, an increased rate that you would support? Would you go to 25? I know I doubt you'd go to 28.
Andrew, I think coming. So Andrew, I think coming out of an economic crisis in which we're still trying to get the economy back up on its feet is not the right time to be raising taxes at all. And as you all know, when you raise taxes on businesses, those businesses end up passing along a lot of those costs to consumers in the form of higher prices, or it depresses wages for their workers. And when we still have millions of Americans out of work, I don't think that's the right step to take at this time.
Okay. Senator Cotton, we appreciate you coming on. Next time, we'll try to bring a CEO on to increase the level of debate, but we appreciate your time this morning. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you all.